So welcome to the MME Roundtable discussion on the Collation and Mapping Research Report relating to migrant and minority ethnic matters in Northern Ireland and produced within Northern Ireland universities. A review led by researcher Dr. Dina Zoe Luigi and supported by Amanda Lubitt. This is a very timely report that has successfully sharpened our focus on the need for increased research on MME matters. And before we watch the video presentation by Dr. Dina, I would like to acknowledge and welcome members of the executive board of the MME Council, Darren Ferguson, who is the founder of Beyond Scheme, Eileen Chan-Hu, who is the co-founder of Crack NI and vice chair of MME, Dr. Asya El-Zaruk, the treasurer, who is unable to make it this evening, and who was the former chair of Obaxuni, Dr. Dina Zoe Beluigi, the research lead for MME, Dr. Maurice McCartney, communications lead, Kawan Sharif, policy and legal, Darwin Thomas, IT lead, and Linda Hutchinson, advocacy lead. So without further ado, I'll now invite us to watch the video presentation, then engage in subsequent discussion. Thank you.
I'm Dina Zoe Beluigi, a member of the think tank Migrant and Minority Ethnic Council and an academic of Queen's University Belfast. I'll be highlighting aspects of a report which presents a mapping of research engagement about matters related to migrant and minority ethnic people, groups or subjects in Northern Ireland, recorded on the public repositories of Northern Irish universities. The project was undertaken by the Migrant Minority Ethnic Council of Northern Ireland, led by myself and supported by Amanda Lubitt, in the period of January to April 2021. The project was partially supported through the ESRC Impact Acceleration account in partnership with Queen's University Belfast. Information about the research engagement items were collated, categorized using tags, and archived to an open source online reference management system, which is hosted on the research page of the MME website for members of the public to access and utilize. I'll be presenting on the report drawn from the data of that archive, which includes the type of item, the subject areas, their subcode, and related listed items, breakdowns of the identifications or social groupings, academic disciplines and concepts covered, and the full bibliography. From that information, figures and graphs have been constructed, which I'll be sharing with you in this recording. Before I begin, it's important I indicate some of the limitations. The research process did not involve in-depth reading of the texts, nor searching the institutional library databases or other repositories. Sources were collated from the databases that the two universities utilized to store and collate research items and to share information open access with the public. Both utilize the pure software. This is where academic outputs have been recorded in recent times to fulfill the obligations of public research institutions in the UK, which means there may be older research and some engagements that have not been made available via these platforms. The report also does not include research undertaken outside of public universities. Please read more about such limitations in the report. This report should be seen as offering a snapshot of the research engagement undertaken by researchers within Queen's University Belfast and Ulster University, which relate to the broad umbrella term migrant and minority ethnic matters, specifically those studies that were conducted about or with those people or communities in Northern Ireland. So what does the report do? It presents information about 176 research items on the repositories, inclusive of conventional means of academic output, including peer-reviewed papers, books, and chapters, in addition to reports, dissertations, blogs, and other research engagement activities. The report breaks these down per institution, indicating from the information available on the repositories that while there has been research undertaken, This is not a mainstream area of research inquiry in either institution. For the most part, the report does not aim to analyze, but rather organize the items. It does so using what we've called subject areas, which were determined by the MME Council to be of particular concern to migrant and minority ethnic groups in Northern Ireland. These include criminal justice, education, employment, environment, health, housing, discrimination, and legislation. So sources may appear in more than one category because they address more than one of the topics. Figure 1 visualizes the sources that fall in each category. The largest category is discrimination, a cross-cutting category that relates to all forms of discrimination. Of the remaining 6 categories, criminal justice and education seem to be the most commonly researched, while environment and housing seem less researched than the other topics. Of the 176 sources placed in the online database, 72 were published in the last 5 years. This is important for noting which findings are current and responsive to changing conditions. Figure 2 visualizes all 8 categories, comparing the number of sources over the past 5 years, which you can see in the lighter color, with the number of sources over all time, the whole bar. You can see that discrimination, criminal justice, health, and then education are the most alluded to in the last 5 years. The least references are to housing, employment, and environment. To shortcut this presentation, have a look at this infographic of the finer coding of the research undertaken in the last 5 years. You will not find this visual in the report. Rather, there you will find far more detail per category. The top line of the graph in white shows all the 176 research items per category in descending order, or from the most referred category to the least. The second horizontal line in grey shows what was done in the last 5 years, with the numbers of items indicated. You can see that health has had an increase in interest during this time, for instance. The finer coding that appears below each category of the grey line was inferred by induction from scans of the item and from deduction from the areas of concern and groups identified by the project partners. If one looks closely, you can see that 27 items of the 72 recorded over the last 5 years have tags that fall under the category of discrimination. These sources can be broken down into 9 subcategories, including educational discrimination, health discrimination, intolerance, racism, and others. All these types of discrimination were counted independently, meaning that if a source addresses multiple types of discrimination, which is common, it can be counted several times. This approach to quantification allows for a better understanding of what types of discrimination get mentioned and how frequently. 17 of the 72 sources over the past 5 years have tags that fall under the category of criminal justice. The majority of research over the past 5 years focuses upon hate crime. That's 9 of the 17 sources. Less frequently referenced were the topics of policing, only 3 of 17, forced labor, 2 of 17. Finally, domestic abuse, prostitution, and human trafficking were the focus of 1 source. 14 of 72 sources over the past 5 years have tags that fall under the category of education. The majority of research over the past 5 years focuses on language, looking at language diversity, language learning, and the teaching of language as a second language. The remaining sources look at educational inequalities, students' attitudes towards minorities and migrants, and traveler education, of which there is only 1 of the 14. 6 of 72 sources over the past 5 years have tags that fall under the category of employment. This category is significantly underrepresented in recent research compared with the 29 sources identified on employment when considering all years. 17 of the sources over the past 5 years have tags that fall under the category of health. The majority of research on health over the past 5 years focuses on mental health and well-being, or general health inequalities and inequities. Less research focuses specifically on women's health, only 3 of 17, with 1 article on pregnancy and 2 on female genital cutting or mutilation. Finally, both substance abuse and suicide appear as the focus of only one source, indicating that further research is needed in these areas. 10 items recorded over the last 5 years have tags that fall under the category of legislation. These resources can be broken into 5 subcategories: Brexit, hate crime, modern slavery, race relations, and social services. 9 items over the past 5 years have tags that fall under the category of housing. The majority of research on housing focuses on asylum seekers and refugees. 6 of the 72 sources over the past 5 years have tags that fall under the category environment. These sources were not further broken down into subcategories because all address similar topics of placemaking and shared spaces. Please do look at the report for your own purposes because you'll see that each subject includes the links to the resources and some of the finer coding to which they relate in ways that may be useful for your interest or use. The report includes tables with more information, such as the demographics, concepts, and research disciplines. Overall, issues relating specifically to the listed demographic categories were underrepresented and under-researched. The most common demographic to appear in sources was gender, appearing in 10% of the sources, most often relating to women. Sexuality and LGBTQ populations appeared less frequently in 4% of sources. Age was less frequently addressed, with just 1 mention. Language was a commonly mentioned topic, appearing in 28 sources. When it comes to that which relate to migrants, most terms are broad generalizations. The terms refugees and asylum seekers appeared frequently in 14% of the sources. Less common were the terms relating to first-generation migrants, only 3, second-generation migrants, only 2, and undocumented workers, only 2. Many different identities were mentioned and are listed in the category race, ethnicity, and nationality. However, few publications focus specifically on one population. Religion did not commonly appear and was not the focus of any of the sources. Most of the tags for religion occurred in articles on hate crime and discrimination. We also provide a table of tags grouped according to certain categories, including the context, such as football or hospitality or Brexit, various facets of discrimination, from anti-Semitism through to violence, gender violence, integration, policing, poverty, and support. Of interest from an academic perspective are the disciplinary areas with a track record in this area, and by their absence, those which don't. Included in the appendices is this alphabetized list of tags and a complete list of references. The appendices also includes a list of all the student dissertations matching our criteria, and it is concerning that there were only 11 of these. However, one should keep in mind that individual institutions vary in their compliance to providing open access postgraduate research reports. One would hope for the sustainability of this knowledge base that this becomes a growing or active concern within teaching and research in the institution. We conclude the report with transparency about the research team and our thanks to the partners and contributors. For that particularly, I would like to thank Amanda Lubbett, who undertook this process early in 2021, a very difficult time during COVID and during her own postgraduate studies here as a migrant scholar. With thanks also to Lynn Gort of the Research and Enterprise Directorate of Queen's University for her assistance, the committee of the ESRC Impact Acceleration Account, and Dr. Michael O'Connor of Queen's Library for information about postgraduate research open access requirement at UK universities, Dr. Ibra Brachat of Queen's University, and the council members of the MME Council for their support, challenge, and guidance. This report forms part of a larger program of activities following its launch. Please subscribe to our website at mmecouncil.org for updates as they happen, and to email feedback, comments, questions, or suggestions, and for details on how to follow us on social media.
Thanks very much for that wonderful presentation, Dina. I'll just invite you to set the scene, and then we'll discuss some of the themes, some cross-cutting themes there. Thanks, Dina.
Thank you, Alfred, and thanks, council members. I'd like to welcome you to each comment. I guess when it comes back to the conversation, I also will comment as a council member, but to welcome comments and questions, which I will try to answer either from the report or to make note of, to ask the researchers when we have follow-up activities, or to search in terms of the online library that we have on our website. So I welcome your comments. I don't know who would like to start.
Thank you very much, Dina. That was excellent, and it was an excellent presentation of an excellent report. I suppose that'll keep me busy anyway, digging into some of the finer details, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of other people who will be digging in excitedly to find out the treasures that are in there. I think you were talking about some of the reports that have been produced over the last 5 years, and for example, that there weren't that many on policing. I guess it's important to remind people that academic work can sometimes take quite a while to come out. So there are almost certainly lots of people even now working away on policing issues connected with the Black Lives Matter protests and so forth. And that won't be coming out until maybe, the autumn or thereabouts. I mean, I'm assuming that your plan is to keep refreshing the store, and so that in other words, there's a chance to address some of those imbalances. Would you want to comment on that?
Yes, definitely. Academic publication, when it's submitted to a journal, can take anything from 6 months to about 2 years before something is published. And so that process takes a long time, and you're right, there's a lag from when you actually begin to collect the research, to analyze it, theorize it, and then make it public. We will be adding to the archive, and in fact, part of the process of engaging with the researchers is to try and develop a more collaborative culture with them. We've used an online online reference management tool, and some of our researchers have asked to become part of that online group, so they can directly add their resources to the online group, which is fantastic. It's even easier than adding it to their university research repositories. But of course, that takes time and commitment. So even people who are listening now or later, who have research that they would like to add, could email the MME and ask for the items to be added, because as much as what we've done is research, is collect academic research, there's a lot of research being done outside of university spaces that is valid and timely and represents a whole lot of different perspectives, and that can also be added to our library too.
Yep, if I can come in and just make a general comment, first of all, to thank you very much for a very comprehensive and much needed report. So thanks to yourself, Dina, and to Amanda as well. I suppose one of the goals enshrined in MME's 5-year strategy is to facilitate research, informed discussions that would enable interaction, deeper comprehension, and dialogue, and also critical questioning of issues of common concern and issues that matter specifically to migrant and minority communities and individuals. So I think this report is quite essential and crucial. It's definitely a crucial resource for community workers, policy developers, decision makers, politicians, and academics. It goes beyond just anecdotes or anecdotal stories, which are sometimes categorized as personal accounts rather than facts, and somewhat regulated as well, and their reliability are sometimes questioned. But this resource provides an empirical collection of evidence in a central place, central hub, which is open and accessible to everyone, and can be used by the general public and also by public authorities as well, service providers in their planning to improve the lives of everyone and the general outcomes for people who may be disadvantaged, vulnerable, or marginalized. So I think in order for us to collectively make a positive difference across society in the areas of social justice, education, housing, environment, everything you've listed there in your report, health, good relations, community cohesion, etc., resources such as this are and must be seen as invaluable. And the recommendations coming from the publications that you've collated should be explored and implemented within the framework of equality, fairness, and inclusion. So that's my kind of general statement. I'll probably leave somebody else to comment before I go more deeply into some of the specifics. Thanks, Dina.
If I may add, Alfred, I mean, I think what we've been able to do through a report like this and through a collation is to try to bring such resources together. And you're right, hopefully now it'll be easier for those who are making policies to refer to them, or different community groups to have evidence that they can reference easy at their fingertips. Not all of the papers are published open access. We have the open access information. So they may land up on a page that refers to the research, but they can't actually open the document because unfortunately it's embargoed by the publishers. What it does allow them to do though is even if they land up on a page like that, it has the email of the researcher. And as researchers, they are the authors of their texts and they can share it privately with anyone. So if there is anyone who lands up seeing a resource that is about a particular topic, but it's embargoed from them, they then can directly and should directly reach out to the researcher to get access to that document. What we try to do with this report, though, is to withhold analysis. So we haven't brought together what the different documents say, and some of them may not be operating from a social justice perspective. We cannot presume that. What they have done is to apply certain epistemic lenses and to come out with findings. So it's going to be very interesting in the discussions that we have following on with this from the researchers is to hear what lenses they had, to hear in what ways they included the perspectives of the participants in ways that were just and ethical, what some of the challenges were with making sure that their findings did actually have impact. So those are going to be follow-on conversations that I think will be very important to help us also disentangle some of the ways in which research operates in Northern Ireland, and both the positives of who listens to such reports and the difficulties along the way too.
If I could come in on that, I think it's an excellent resource, particularly the way that it has been tagged and mapped and shown the interlinking between the areas. My background is mostly in housing, and looking at that to see hate crime under the criminal justice system, but to see intolerance and racism in the discrimination area, and all of those have an impact at the end of the line on housing, and they're all interrelated. So I think it's very valuable to be able to do a search from that perspective. What you touched on there too is, I think, the real value of a resource like this. It's not about tidying it all up and having them sitting on a shelf that people can access them. You'd mentioned there about it gives that evidence to people working in the sector that they can go along. So many times it's that practical side that lets projects down. You go along to a funder, you try to raise an issue, and they say you have no evidence that this is actually a problem. And there you can actually go to the resource and perhaps find the evidence, or perhaps even more valuable, you can go and say, look, out of all of this resources here and this research, there's nothing up to date because no one has looked at it, and we need to look at it. And I'm thinking in particular there of the work that's been done, a tremendous amount of work that's been done recently by the Department for Communities, around the social inclusion and the various strategies that they had developed there. And on the 4 different strategies that looked at around anti-poverty, around gender and discrimination, a whole range of areas, every single report mentioned the lack of research and the lack of data that's available. And looking at yours, I was able to go in very, very quickly, look up anti-poverty, find out a piece of research that was done there. But looking at poverty in Northern Ireland, it was done in 2013. So it's great from that point of view to not only say what is there, but also to say, let's look at the gaps and let's get some research done, because it has to come to a practical use for us to benefit in the community. But it's terrific to see it.
I'm wondering, Linda, do you think it would be a good idea for me just to share my screen and show people how they might use the resource in quite a practical and easy way, so they don't have to wade through the report?
Yes, because I think the one that I was looking at is around those social inclusion strategies. So many of them said in the first place that the data was not being gathered, and there's a lot about monitoring, and that's something that we've been pushing for many years. I mean, there has been best practice around ethnic monitoring out since 2011, and yet it's still in the new race equality strategy saying we need more ethnic monitoring, we need to look at it, we need to look at this area. And then all of the strategies by the Department for Communities raised this issue again. And the one there was looking at poverty and ethnicity in Northern Ireland, that again, you can go in and search for something like that. I found that valuable.
Okay, let me search for poverty. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen now. This is the MME website. And if people click on research, they're taken to this page. If they scroll down, you can see there's a block that says Research Archive. And anyone clicking that will then be taken to this bank. And on here, we've started to collect, in a haphazard way mostly, a whole lot of documents and resources related to MME matters in Northern Ireland. Where this report gets its information is what's under research. So if you click under research, and then go to Northern Ireland publications, you'll see that we have output from the Open University and all the other universities. But if we were looking, such as Linda said, on something to do with poverty, one could type in a search term on the top right-hand corner, and everything that relates to poverty would then come up. And you can see that in the last, it is not quite in the last 5 years, but certainly Wallace and others produced a number of publications in this area. And then, so if a person went to that and double clicked on it, it would take you directly to that document. So this is an open access document. In other cases, it may not be. So this here, for instance, just going back to what I was telling you earlier, if this is not accessible, it takes you to the university page and you can see the researchers who did that work. If they are still in the university, you can then click on their names and it'll take you directly to their profile with their contact details. If they have left the university though, it won't. So I'm hoping that's helpful.
So I'll come in here, Dina, because I mean, I'll ask you a question, but I'll want to say a wee bit more as well. But is this the first time this kind of data has been gathered together in this way, as this kind of library? Is it at this level? Because it's a lot of work in that, and seems to be a real gift actually for the entire sector to have all that kind of in one place. So is that the first time this has been done?
From my knowledge in terms of Northern Ireland, yes, I would say so. I don't see other existing resource on what universities have produced. But from conversations that I think some of the council members here said, is there was a time when one of the organizations was active in collecting resources and trying to make them available in hard copy. Now, of course, now that things are digital, actually, it's much easier And the open access movement, which is very much about global social justice, supports this, the understanding that knowledge is a commons that we should all have access to. So doing this sort of work is something that's happening, I guess, all over the world. But from the bit that I know, I think this is the first time that it's been done, particularly for these communities in Northern Ireland.
No, it's a fabulous bit of research, and there's so much obviously work on it. And for those of us who don't have the kind of academic side of the head function all the time, I think it's very accessible. I've just found it really accessible, and even the PDF research is something we should just have permanently on our laptops. It's something to dive into, as when Linda says, when people ask you for that data, you can reach and grab it. So I think it's a really fabulous resource, and I'm thrilled to see it coming in that way. So I think that the entire sector will benefit from it greatly, and I'm sure it'll be used in many funding applications, and from many organisations will avail of all that data and that information. So well done on that.
Yeah. So thank you. Can I jump in then? Yes. A great piece of research. I think Dina's presented it, absolutely fabulous. A lot of work into that, and thank you to Amanda as well. Number of points, I think. So I think one is at this Migrant and Minority Ethnic Council, one of our aims is to, and Alfred can keep me right as chair, is to be influencing policy and develop policies. And I'm just wondering, with such a wide range of research, are we aware from this which one made an impact or were sent to policymakers? Is there any way of, checking that or reading that? I mean, it's an awful lot of work, but where did it go in the end? Did it do anything, or is that an area that we need to now look at?
I mean, I think that's definitely something we'll be asking the researchers as we go ahead. The online repository of the universities, this pure software, allows researchers to put up a bit of research and to link it with their pathways to impact, they're called. And this is a big agenda now in the UK, to make sure that if you've done the research, you do what you can to try to make sure that it has either a conceptual impact or a policy impact, or, there are various types of impacts. And in fact, part of the framework for assessing research excellence is around impact. So technically, even these pure software should allow for that, but it's not actually often not put into practice that much. And so I think where we'll really get to hear about it is when we, as a council, engage in the follow-on activities with the researchers, because I think sometimes it's a lot more complicated than just sending it to a policymaker. There's also often not a lot of support for that process, and sometimes there are complications, such as academics, myself included, speak strange jargon. We don't necessarily know how policymakers work. So there's a number of processes there. There also often is not that many rewards for doing that work. It's not often supported. So it's going to be fascinating to hear that. And if you think we only have 70 something items in the last 5 years, that's actually a tiny amount of research. So it becomes even more precious to hear in what ways has it really been used for change. So that's one of the questions that I'm the most interested in, really, when we speak to them later.
Yeah, okay. And the second point is around, the minority ethnic communities that obviously have been involved in the research. How often would they get the feedback on it? I think I'm a bit out of the loop the last number of years, but when I was younger, in my 20s, when research was done with us at the Chinese Welfare, we got the recommendations and we worked at them, and we were working to, support the policy development or use it in our funding, as you've talked about earlier, because the researchers came back and gave us the feedback and the recommendations. I suppose we were supported in that aspect. I remember the old days of Derek Wilson at Ulster University, nodding his head, and Karen Keevan who consulted on us on community relations, and that encouraged us at Chinese Welfare to write our own community relations strategy, because we learned some methodology in the way it was working and also understood the recommendations coming from it. So I think that's a very important part, to get the engagement and involvement of the communities. And the second part to my question is, how many of those members who are researchers come from ethnic minority communities themselves? It's 2021 now, how many years of research in this area? It must be like 20, 30 years of minority ethnic research, but I can't seem to find anybody that comes from migrant and minority ethnic member themselves that has experienced Northern Ireland.
I mean, you're touching on two very, very important parts about the sort of democratization of higher education, really, but particularly here in Northern Ireland, making sure that it's has a healthy democratic participation in knowledge production. The involvement of communities, the closing the loop in terms of research findings, the lessening of power dynamics between the researcher and who is researched. These will definitely be things I've made a note of and, we'll ask the researchers when we engage with them. The interesting thing about your question of how many of these people who are researchers come from these communities, I haven't done analysis of that, right? But it is definitely something we can ask when we engage. I do know that there are 1 or 2 people within Queen's, but simply because I am in Queen's myself, and I'm part of the staff group that is Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, and international staff, that we have a tiny amount of staff that fall under that, and that the statistics of which staff come from which backgrounds or might fall under which backgrounds are not readily available. How many of them then choose to do such research is another issue. Many academics don't want to be essentialized according to their identities. But there is an important concern that people are not extracting or making use of the suffering or the circumstances of others, but that actually communities are developing their own resources and their own voice within communities, but also within the academy. So I think your question is absolutely valid. What I did find interesting was that it seemed to be more in terms of, at least if one looks at surnames, right? I mean, I know it's a flawed process, but if one looks at surnames, it's more the postdoctoral researchers. And Drew Michael is one example. And also the dissertations, PhDs. There seemed to be more of an interest and alignment. What is really worrying, and this is why I emphasized it in my presentation, I couldn't help myself as a researcher of higher education, is that there was so little PhDs done in this area. And even though we can say, well, they might be in the library or something else, that signals that there isn't a generation of researchers coming through with an interest in this area. And if this is going to be a sustained area of research, then that is very problematic. When you look at some of the, I know I'm going slightly off the topic, but I think this is quite important. When you look at some of the research areas, you can literally see the impact that one researcher can make. The work, particularly if you look at the work on sex work, one researcher has made an unbelievable amount of impact in collaboration with others, but he has led that. If that researcher goes and doesn't have generations following him who are working in this area, that entire area disappears. So people become very precious, and so does looking at what subjects are being taught at these universities and how they align, what opportunities there are within Science Shop, for instance, which is an academic community engagement initiative to really build future generations of scholars who are invested in this area. Because from what I think, there is not a lot of research monies for this, and there is not necessarily a lot of prestige associated with looking at Northern Ireland ethnic minorities issues, while there might be more in terms of England. So these are some of the things that I'll definitely try to tease out with the researchers, but they're crucial, Eileen. So I'm really glad you brought them up.
I'll give you an anecdotal thing. You just brought it to mind. I remember a piece of research Alfred and Darren may remember at the times. Cheryl and I did a piece of research in Mid-Ulster about minority ethnic communities. And that piece was actually put into the Multicultural Resource Centre. You were talking about the place where it was all kept together. And it was because of that, I remember I invited Cheryl when I started the project in Ballymena, an Ethnic Minorities Project, to give a talk, because I was interested in how she was doing a sort of inter-ethnic type piece of work, with the communities down there. And that was to start the way we were working in Ballymena. She then went on to set up the Latin American Society, and that was quite successful. But as you say, as time goes on, that person leaves, things change. But it was instrumental at the time to have Cheryl do that piece of work and come from that research background, and made movements in the Latin American Society at the time. I mean, Darren may remember those early days. It was really quite. They were down in York Street. And that was one point. I just came off a phone call today from somebody looking for a young person to sit on government structures, civil society, I know you're smiling here, and be the age, I think, 16 to 25 from an ethnic minority background, and understand well-being. So I had a good discussion about my observations lately around young people that I've seen in different talks, and I don't think they're in those sectors. I may be wrong. You may need to do research on this, but the sectors of community development, social sciences, those areas are not, and Northern Ireland is very heavily towards community relations, public service work. Young people could be in STEM, or could be in architecture, could be in legal, could be in business. And I'm sure there could be strong research done with ethnic minorities in those areas. Trends and patterns are changing as well. And now, even our group, there's not many of us that are second generation ethnic minority working in the community sector. So these are all symptomatic of where things have to be found for issues. Darren?
Maybe that's something to follow up as well, as what happens to this research, because I remember that research very well with Latin American Association there, and because they were involved in a project we did, Beyond Skin, and we were the first to get money at DFID for a big programme in Northern Ireland. So it did lead on to stuff, led on to kind of activism as well. But I suppose looking at the graph, I mean, I got to page 3 on the PDF, and I was quite interested to see when you see it visually. And Mars will probably echo this, because for me, to see research on the environment at the very least, when that's probably the going to be the biggest thing which will drive discrimination and everything else we see in that graph, because of what way the world's going. And climate refugees is going to be the next big buzz term, which we're going to have to, which will just come into all our language as people migrate because of climate change. So do you think those trends, when we look at that graph, do you think those bars will change and there'll be a lot more research done on like the environment and the things which are kind of, there hasn't been much research done at all? I mean, Dean, I suppose, can you see that happening at all?
It's so difficult to tell. More and more, certainly within higher education, it depends on what funding there is. That is how you justify your time. And if there is funding on the environment where the researchers don't only include the dominant Northern Irish groups, but do include minority ethnic groups, then sure, of course, there's a lot being done on the environment, but not necessarily really looking at the whole range of voices that are in Northern Ireland. And what's interesting when you do look at it, I mean, in the last 5 years, there've only been 6. And what the issues are on environment are, these are the tags: public spaces, placemaking, urban planning, and shared spaces. So I do know that there's a large project now in Belfast in terms of Belfast as a place, But will they look at issues that affect migrants and minority ethnic people? You can't be sure unless there is a big push for that to happen, really. So I don't know. That's something that we need to monitor, and I think as a think tank to push for.
Absolutely.
If I could come in there too, I think an important point on that, as you say, is where the funding comes from and what the funding is for, and that often that comes with a particular agenda, and that may not be the same as what the people on the ground actually need. And that's why it's so important that the people who are being impacted by it get to say, yes, but you need to look at this issue. This is what we're worrying about day in, day out, not these other issues that you're dealing with. It's so important that it's involved at that level. And again, it's the interrelationship between all of them. For example, looking at shared space, and the questions have to be asked about hate crime, about racism, about the feelings that people being comfortable there. And unless that data is collected and analysed, it's very easy to ignore a lot of groups. I mean, that was a statement someone had said before about the hard to reach groups. If you turn that round, it's not that they're hard to reach, it's that they're easy to ignore. And it's making sure that that research gets to that right level and starts from where it's needed. When people start raising their issues here, we need someone to look at it and analyse it.
Certainly, I think another complication, I mean, I stand corrected, but this is something that I'm hoping will come out in the discussions. But another issue is that funding that comes from the UK is about the UK. And there are sometimes well-trodden relationships with migrant or minority communities in England or Scotland that are easier for people to access. Or you know, if the funding is about it so generally, you can talk about the UK and not differentiate and look at the particularness of Northern Ireland. And so if a person was to go to these portals and type in ethnic minority or BAME, you'll find far more that's happening in terms of England than you will find in Northern Ireland. And I think that is a particular complication of the funding and what is sometimes easier, and maybe also some risk associated with small groups and ethics. But I'm not entirely sure. We can't be sure yet what is happening in behind the scenes until we actually ask the researchers. And that's why I think these interviews are going to be really interesting.
I think if I can sort of jump in, I think I'm probably a bit more optimistic, I guess. As I sort of hinted at the beginning, it takes a long time for the research to go through all the processes. As from what I now know, having been working in the sort of central part of Queens for a few years now, the wheels grind very slowly in there too. But they are grinding, and I think they're moving in the right direction. Because I think, for example, there is an increasing emphasis on, you know, you were saying about the environment, the idea of placemaking and shared spaces is becoming much more important from what I've seen anyway, in Queens, and I think it's the same in Ulster. And indeed, there's one of the things I've been encouraged through this whole process of reading this report and seeing all the stuff that's on the website is that, and as we've started to reach out to researchers, you suddenly find more and more people that you didn't know existed. And they're working on things, and they're working on language classes for refugees, and they're working on, so it's not just academic, it's quite practical, and it is in touch with the communities that need to be brought in. So I'm kind of encouraged, and I think there's a gathering momentum. We'll maybe not see it bear fruit immediately, but I've just got a good feeling that there's going to be a lot more stuff that's going to be, you're going to be busy, Dina, or somebody's going to be busy typing and putting those links in. So
No, I think, Morris, you are right. I mean, I think there's a difference, and perhaps in my caution, what I was trying to signal is the difference between the conditions that are created for research, and that's the funding environment, that is the different levers that are created to encourage researchers and to give communities a voice in how research funding is formulated, what calls are put out, those sorts of things. So those are the sort of structural concerns around research. But one can see that these researchers are producing work, and some of them are very committed to these areas. You can see them producing a number of bits of research. And one of the positives, as Morris was saying, is I mean, a lot of the members today have spoken about what's going to be of benefit for community groups. There's a huge benefit for the researchers to know who's doing other things across their own institutions and across other institutions, because then you begin to have transdisciplinary research that looks at phenomena that are happening socially from a number of different angles. And so you can have sociologists interacting with researchers in medical health, interacting with those who are looking at issues of housing or whatever, and looking at a really complex phenomenon. So that was something that has been very encouraging, is researchers saying, when we've had a bit of contact with them, saying, I thought I was sort of the only one doing this area. I didn't realize that there were so many other things happening. And then also the stuff that's not about research, the stuff that is about teaching of different groups, that a lot of people are doing and have been doing without the prestige of research. It's really good to see some of that coming out too. So I'm hoping the benefits will be really across the board as we give more attention to this and bring in other people who've been perhaps doing this work for a long time and haven't felt the larger momentum.
If I could just come in, I suppose for me, there are two things that come to mind in terms of what we've been talking about. One is the production of research, which is good, and in my when I contacted the City Council with regards to this publication, I was interested in ensuring that there was a call for increased research pertaining to migrant and minority ethnic communities and individuals. But I think looking at your reports, over the past 30 years or so, you've listed 176 sources, and in the last 5 years, 41% of those sources were recorded and produced within the last 5 years. I wonder if the increase in the number of sources recorded within the last 5 years has any correlation with the increased number of migrants. And also if, there's an increased interest in MME issues within academia as a whole. I suppose that's one question. Nonetheless, I feel the 176 sources are significant in some way, but I still feel there's a gap. There's a gap in terms of conducting research to gauge the impact of the research publications themselves. So basically what I'm saying is, how do we translate outcomes or findings from research to reform? So we have all these publications, all these research documents, which is fantastic, and you have recommendations there. But how can we move a step further to gauge, the impact of the recommendations and the findings, and if they've been really translated to bring about improvement in the lives of people? Because it's good to have all this nice publication statistics and outflow and things like that, and to increase understanding as well. But if there is no real impact, and we can't translate all these recommendations that are coming from this very, very good research publications into tools or into systems that would bring about change, then maybe there's a gap there that needs to be looked at.
Definitely. Certainly for me as a researcher of higher education, that would be, for me, that is part of the purpose of higher education, is to perform its role in addressing societal ills or other ills through research. That in itself is an additional study, Alfred, how one does these things. But it seems that it cannot all be put on the shoulders of the researcher. And I know you're not suggesting that. There are steps that researchers can take, and I think we need to ask them, what have they taken? I think many of them are very invested in their work and want it to have impact. But it also requires reception in terms of policymakers and in terms of politicians and others who have power to affect change.
Yeah.
So there's a larger life cycle in this process that we need to be looking at, and where we can, trying to lever and maneuver things to make sure that it is looked at. In terms of your question about has the increase been because of the increase in communities? Maybe. But the other thing we need to be careful of is not all the older research was put onto these repositories. Because of these repositories were only created a number of years ago. And what we do know is that particularly for the cycle of assessment, where universities get assessed for their research, that's a research excellence framework. They looked at the last 8 years in particular, and perhaps some of them were put in before that. So we can't be sure everything's up there. It was encouraging to see very old 30-year-old research. I think one of the older pieces is by Don Hastings, who has actually engaged with us since and said, that was engaging with the Indian community at that time. And we will be interviewing him in the weeks to come to hear how he felt that doing that research at that time was received. But we can't presume that the increase in numbers means that it was because there wasn't stuff being done before. I just wanted to qualify that as well.
Could I come in maybe on something for us for the future as well? As I had mentioned there about the social inclusion strategies and how they had all highlighted the lack of data and the lack of research. The process that they're going through at the moment is that the expert panels highlighted these areas, and the next stage is that they will be developing action plans and strategies to address this. So I think it's something that as a council we'll keep an eye on to see. They've clearly identified there are gaps. Let's see if there is research detailed in those action plans, and keep an eye to see how that's moving forward. Or can it link into some of the research that's already there? That'll probably be coming out from about August on. So it's a really good opportunity to tap into those.
I think that's it's one of the things that, again, we have been able to do as a MME Council, is to be able to keep an eye out for when consultations are emerging, and then make contact with some of our research partners and bring the two together so that we can tap into their expertise, and that's fed straight into the policy making decision makers and so forth. So I think that's a good function of the MME Council, and it's going to be made much easier by the repository that we've now got available, which above all else, will allow us to, make contact with more researchers, and as it grows, we'll be able to get more and more specialists in touch with the politicians and decision makers and civil servants, perhaps more importantly. So.
Yes, I mean, now hopefully we can build a community of researchers who we interact with and who also continue to interact with more of the community groups. But it's a really perfect point, actually, that Morris is bringing up, because one of the examples of when we've been able to do that was a response to a call for discussion on ethnic disparities and inequalities in the UK. And we produced a document, as everyone on the council knows, with a number of researchers, I think about 12 researchers, directly responding to that consultation call. And it was evidence-based. It ticked all the boxes that it should have been, but the report wasn't referenced or looked at at all when it came out. The civil report didn't reference the report, the consultation response that we compiled with these authors. And there's an example of how, despite the quite extensive time that it took to create a translation document that directly addressed the concerns that they were raising, there wasn't a reception to hear about the research findings in that area. And so there are sometimes problematics involved. But I certainly think that Northern Ireland would be quite different in that case. I hope so, that we have a smaller space and a more receptive area for commissions in areas of ethnic disparities and inequality than there might be in terms of the larger UK environment.
I think I can come in after that. Yeah, thanks, Linda, for that question, and Dina on, having it included into, like, for example, the social inclusion strategy. Further to the all-party group meeting that I attended last week on ethnic minorities, the importance of having research and evidence is clear. I use parts of it. I have that sort of, knowledge base from the past, that we can add into it, and using experience that we know. Gave a presentation and, presented on the areas of the SEAL report that we had not thought, that we disagreed on, or, we didn't support. The good thing was the group did agree on the reaffirmation to publicly reaffirm determination to uncover and dismantle systemic, structural and institutional discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity. So I think there is importance of using research to be informative and educative, and to present that. I know it was a small meeting, but it has the group that were there from the minority ethnic communities found it very useful. They know that we have an RPA research policy group, and I think we had information that we could give, and I think that's the importance of research, that we provide good information that's of educative value to give those sort of informed decisions. So I think, yeah, I mean, I'm positive too, Maurice, in that aspect, but it just takes that next step.
I mean, Darren, didn't you think it was interesting that there wasn't so much about the arts?
Yeah, you know what? When you sent me the PDF, it's the first thing I put into the research thing was arts. It's the first thing I put in. I always do that just to see where that. Yeah, I found the environment and the arts definitely big surprises there. When one's definitely a solution, one's definitely going to be our biggest shared problem we're going to face as a global society. Never mind just a Northern Ireland society. So, but as Maurice says, maybe all that stuff is going through this system, and that research will come out. Maybe that is going through the cogs are grinding in that department. Yeah.
I mean, for me as a researcher of higher education, I found it quite disconcerting that none of the texts in education whatsoever looked at further education or higher education at all. I think that's a huge gap. And from what I know in terms of trying to address problematics in terms of the status quo, if there isn't looking at what it's like to access higher and further education, to flourish within that space, that has a knock-on effect then on who lands up being in leadership positions within society. So that's something that I was quite worried about. And there's also been no research done in terms of sanctuary and university spaces, which I'm very much hoping will happen in time. But it was interesting that is sort of conspicuously absent.
I did notice that as well, the class research, shall we say, which I think is really important. And I think, especially with funding, where it's really targeted areas of deprivation, and they would never fund stuff in more middle class areas because they don't see that to be a problem. When the reality is that's where our decision makers are going to come from in the future, those areas. That's the people we need to influence. So Yeah, I noticed the class thing. It would be really interesting research as well to see about the class divide and how that impacts um, ethnic minorities and kind of integration as well.
So that's again possibly something that might come up when we discuss the funding, because there may be a construction of minority ethnic peoples as always disadvantaged, as always somehow in deficit, not with the potential to flourish. And, so that maybe that's part of the reason why the arts isn't necessarily looked at, because it's just social responsibility. It's not necessarily like part of the contribution or, so it's interesting to see what aspects of research are maybe associated with certain characteristics of certain groups, and that's a concern. It's almost like it's called epistemic violence. There's a reproduction then of how those people are created. But that's again something that really would be interesting to engage with the researchers about.
Yeah, well, in closing, I believe this has been a very productive discussion. And it has been worthwhile just carrying out some sort of deep dive into the issues highlighted by the report as well. So thank you very much again, Dina, for a very comprehensive report that is quite invaluable to this sector, as Darren said. I know there's going to be more work done in terms of podcasts, talking to lecturers and researchers as well. I know Eileen will be working with Darren to talk to the community sector with regards to some of the issues that we've highlighted within the report. So thanks once again for being part of this roundtable discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to have another session at some point. So thank you very much.